Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, the Layers Masterclass. So we're looking at all things layers today. If this is your first webinar, my name is David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. As I said, today is going to be all about the layers side of things. What I'm going to try and do maybe a bit differently, and hopefully it's not going to fail, is to, rather than kind of go through feature 1, 2, 3, is just try and show you all with some practical examples. So that's the goal. As I said, might fail, but let's see how it goes. Maximum of 60 minutes today. We'll probably be able to use all of that up because it is quite a deep subject. We could probably speak for 2 hours, but I don't think anyone has that attention span. I am going to send you a recording. If you were here last week, I forgot to send you the follow-up email, so I'll do that tomorrow. But you will get a follow-up email sometime tomorrow. You're very welcome and encouraged to submit your questions at any time on today's subject. At the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see that the last box is called questions. Put a question in there that will come straight through to me. If you're on your iOS device or Android device, look for the question mark icon and you can tap that and the question will come straight through to me as well. So let us begin. Let's just go back to the start. So the idea is to show you sort of some practical examples of various different things. And I'll go through, we'll start fairly basic, and then we'll kind of gear up to do something a bit more complicated as well. Just because it's complicated doesn't mean it's hard. It will actually save you lots of time and help you get moving quicker. All right, so let's start with an easy example. I'm going to get rid of the camera off and on, just so we can save a bit of resources and so on. So, first of all, let's go to our layers panel, or I should say the layers tool. Appears in either the color, exposure, or details tool tab by default, because that's generally where you're going to want to put in some layered adjustments. So I just heard a strange noise. I thought it was my computer, but it's a helicopter going overhead. So I was sorry for the pause. I was slightly worried. So either going to be color, exposure, or details tool tab. And then we have our layers tool here, which basically shows you what layers are in use, the ability to turn them on and off and edit them and so on and so forth. So let's do something super simple just so we get the idea of the concept. So we have an image here, for example. Let's just get this front and center. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, you can see on this image, on the background layer, all our sharpening is disabled. Quite often, let's go up to 50, not quite 100%. Quite often, when we're talking about working with layers, is that people always assume, okay, working with layers is just for doing different exposure adjustments, for example. And that's not the case. We can use layers for all kinds of different things. And just as I said, to start off with something simple, we will go for just some local sharpening. So you can see in this shot, it's relatively shallow depth of field. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to sharpen everything. We might as well just sharpen the subject. So let's just zoom out of this guy a little bit so we have everything to around here. So first of all, in our layers panel, going to make a new layer. Always good to name your layers so you know what on earth is going on. So I just call this sharpening, like so. Grab our brush, so that's the brush icon here, or if we click and hold, we can reveal the different options. Now, B for brush is a good thing to remember, E for erase, and we get to the other kinds in a minute, and M on your keyboard to show and hide the mask. Very useful. So if you can remember B, E, and M, that will save you a fair amount of time. And then once our brush icon, you can see it down here a bit easier, is active, we can then right click to change the various options. So right now I'm just going to deal with size and hardness. and we're just going to draw a basic mask. So that's M on my keyboard. So I just want to sharpen this bit like so. M to turn it off. Let's zoom into 100% actually. And then now we can just apply our sharpening. If I go nuts, so you can just see it appearing on that area, then we can just apply our sharpening in that zone and that zone only. And also let's throw in a bit of structure, tiny bit of structure as well. Because remember, on each layer, you can have various different adjustments. Don't think that one layer just has to have an exposure adjustment, a contrast adjustment, or whatever. It could be a whole combination of things. A couple of you asking about mouse, pen, etc. Sorry, that's a bit out of focus. I find it much... Can we focus you? There we go. I find it much easier to work with a pen and tablet for layers. I mean, for basic stuff, probably doesn't matter too much just using a mouse. But I think when you get to, you know, working with, you know, skin textures and dodging and burning, it's really difficult to use a mouse. So the problem with a mouse, of course, is that if you want to dodge and burn, it's just not very fluid, whereas using a pen, it's much more like drawing. So I have a courtesy of Wacom, thank you Wacom, an Intuos Pro, sorry, one of the later ones. You don't have to spend that much money. To be honest, just with the most basic Intuos would be 100 times better than a mouse. It will probably drive you crazy for 24 hours. But once you get into the difference of, you know, with a mouse, you push the cursor around. With a pen, wherever the pen is where it is in relation to the screen. So once you get used to that, I don't think there's anything looking back. Okay, so real basic one, obviously, M to see the mask. Once more, M to see the mask. If I press E to get the eraser, I can get rid of it. And then B, of course, I can always brush in more sort of points if I want to. So that's super simple start. If we go a bit more involved, like so, let's just get rid of what I did before. That looks scary, doesn't it? Get rid of those. So here we've got a shot which, again, for local sharpening might make sense. So if I go and zoom in a little bit more, where are we? 300%, maybe a bit aggressive there, David. Let's go to 100%. And in this case, on a background layer, and you know, you can consider your background layer is useful for things like your exposure adjustments, your white balance adjustments, all the kind of environmental stuff. And then the layers is about kind of building up adjustments in different bits of the image. So let's say on this image, because we want to sort of soften it, we do some negative clarity, but I might like to sharpen some of those areas back, like eyes and flowers. And then we've got down here, we've got the glitter on our hands as well. So it might be nice to sharpen some of that stuff up. So the way we did it before, remember, was to draw the mask and then add some sharpening. So now we'll introduce you to a better technique, which is to first start with a filled layer. So a new filled layer will basically add a mask over the whole image, which you can see in red. Think, why on earth would you do this? And the idea is that you can pre-visualize the adjustments that you're then going to brush in. So for example, let's see, we are going to add a bit more sharpening. So down here, so I'll gradually increase the sharpening, just looking at her eyes until it looks super crispy. So I think that's pretty good. Maybe I'll add a little bit of structure too. And I might overcompensate slightly, but I think that's good. And now what I'll do is I'll right click on the mask and we're going to clear it. So that'll get rid of the mask, but it will still keep my adjustments intact, which I can then brush back in. So now I'll grab my brush, and then that's a little bit too big, so let's go smaller. I'll brush a bit in here on the eyes. And let's go to 200% so you can see better. And then over here, down here, a little bit on the flowers there, like so. Maybe a bit on the lips. And we can just draw in our selective sharpening wherever you want, basically. So now if I turn this layer off, then you can see before, turn it back on. Just be aware if the viewer jumps a little bit, that's nothing I can control. It's just a current conflict between GoToWebinar and Capture One. Currently working with GoToWebinar to see what we can do about it, but I am aware of it. There's not much I can do. So I've done a couple of things to mitigate it, but it might occasionally get a bit squirrely, just so you know. And then if we go up to her eyes and then turn this off, before and after. So you get the idea. So that's just a really simple way you could do a bit of selective sharpening. Doesn't necessarily have to be exposure, which is what everyone thinks it is. Okay, so let's look at, let's fit that to the screen. Let's look at the good old favorite, just so you know how these work. The linear gradients and radial gradients. Very traditionally used in landscape shots, which is why we've got a landscape shot here to darken, if you like, the top half of an image or the bottom half or whatever. Now in Capture 111, they were, if you like, not very sophisticated. It was only a basic fall off, but now it's much, much better for a few reasons. So if we wanted to darken the sky down up here, first of all, on my background, we do some basic things like we add a bit of clarity, contrast, maybe a bit of structure, just so we've got some detail in the rocks, etc. And that's probably pretty good. So, but the sky is a bit too bright, so we can get some back with highlight recovery, but I'm happy with how it looks in the sea, so it'd be nice if we could target just the sky only. So we grab our linear gradient mask, or G on the keyboard. That gives me a crosshair, which is slightly different, as you can see. So now where I start drawing, the mask will be the strongest, and when I finish drawing, the mask will be at its weakest. Now you can see right now it's at an angle, but if I hold down Shift, then that will lock it horizontally for me. So now if I let go and press M on my keyboard, you can see the mask gets drawn like so. So just a nice simple graduated mask. But the nice thing is, if you weren't happy with that, we can go back and change it, whereas in Capture 111 that wasn't possible. But now as soon as I hover the mouse back on the shot, you see those three lines. And basically what those three lines refer to is the top one. Oh, my cursor's disappeared. Hang on. Let's go back. So the top one is 100%. So that's where the mask is at 100. By the time you got to the middle, it's 50. By the time you got to the last one, you're at 0. So that's basically the fall off between those three lines. Now, the smart thing is that we can be asymmetric, because we might not always want to have a perfectly even fall off from the top of the picture all the way down to the bottom. So if you hold your Alt key down, Alt, then we can actually drag up, say, the bottom line, and then that will give us our asymmetric fall off like so. So now if I let go, we've done the same. And you could do the same on the 100% line as well. And equally, if you hold Shift down and drag either of these lines, you'll see they're expand and close to the same amount, like so. So a couple of handy little tips. And then now, once we're happy with that, if I press M to hide it, we could darken down the sky, for example. Chuck in more clarity. We could heap it on. It's not really going to hurt us. And maybe a bit more contrast and so on. Now, if I thought, oh, actually, I just want to erase a little bit of that, you might be forward into thinking, you could grab your erase brush and think, you know what, I would just like to get rid of, if I just make my brush a bit bigger, I just want to get rid of a little bit over here. So I start trying to erase, and this message pops up. It says, do you want to rasterize the mask? So remember, before we did this, I could always go back and change the gradient lines, the top and bottom or the middle. So I could always edit it basically. But now if I'm trying to erase it, it's no longer a parametric mask, so a mask that can be edited. So what we can do is basically lock the mask in this state. So if we say rasterize, it happens instantly. We've still got the mask that we had before, but now with the erase brush, I could take a piece out of it if I wanted to. So you can edit those masks, but you do have to rasterize them first. If you right click on any layer, then you can always see the rasterize option as well. Same goes for luminosity masks, which we'll look at as well. If you want to stop them being a luminosity mask or a linear mask, you first have to rasterize it. So it's a very handy feature to give you the best of both worlds. As we can see in this shot, that's a pretty grubby sensor, but if we turn that layer off and on, you can see the effect like so. Alrighty, next one. So radial gradient like so. Similar kind of principle. So linear is just top to bottom or left to right or diagonal. Radial is basically a more useful circular shape than what you can do with the vignetting tool. So if we go and grab the radial gradient mask, or T on your keyboard, if you can remember that. Again, that gives you a similar crosshair. Probably a bit hard to see right here, but a cross with a circle. And then where I start drawing, the radial mask will expand out from that central point. So if you want to have your radial mask right in the middle, start drawing in the middle, and as you draw, you'll see it will pop out from the middle like so. And once again, we have those three lines, 100%, 50, and 0. 4 little handles, which I can grab to change the size. We can go outside of the image if we wish. And then we can also grab the fall off lines to change the fall off. So if I press M on my keyboard like so, you can see the effect of that mask. Now if we want to rotate it, you just have to hover anywhere and just twist or hover on the middle line, and then we can rotate that mask. Again, once the cursor is off the image, you can't see the radial lines. If I press M to hide my mask, and then we could change the exposure, or we could desaturate the outsides. Looks quite nice, and so on. So like the linear mask, if I want to go back in and edit, I can just, as long as I have the radial gradient mask cursor tool, I can go back in and then we can tweak the mask exactly to how we want. Good question from Terence and Brenda. Brenda, first of all, can you reverse the radial mask? Yep, 2 ways. You can grab the outside line, so I'm over here, and you can just flip it over the center one, and that reverses it, and then I could expand this one out. So we've got the inverse. I can right click on the layer and say invert as well, and that will pop it back in the other direction. So just right click and say invert, or if we right click in it, we can actually by default set it to a inverted radial mask. So draw mask inside if you like. So lots of different options there basically. Right click to invert, drag the inner over the outer, or right click to permanently set it to draw a mask inside. And Terence was saying, I can't feather with a luma mask. You can if you rasterize it, but when we get to luma mask, you'll actually see you don't really need to feather a luma mask. You can already do that with the tools. Alrighty. Oh, before or after, if you want to know that was Joel asking. Hold your Alt key down, click on the master reset up here, and we can see before and after, like so. Okie dokie. So that was pretty simple. Now we're going to bump up the level a bit and look at what we can do with skin, luminosity, and in a batch. So Terence, this is for you. So first of all, if I make a new layer just by hitting plus, and we hit Luma range, and we start trying to pull these around, you think, why is nothing happening? I'm changing this and I can't see anything. Well, what the Luma range tool is doing is applying a restriction on the mask in the current layer. Now, I didn't draw any mask, so it's got nothing to restrict. So the best advice is to start with a new filled layer, like so. So that's gonna fill me a mask over the entire image. And what I want to do is just restrict it to just the skin tone areas. Because if we look at our model a bit closer, and this is exactly the same for every man, woman, model, no model, that quite often that your hands and face, the skin tone doesn't perfectly match. Of course it doesn't. Obviously there's makeup on the face, but there isn't any on the hands, so you get this kind of tone discrepancy, especially if your body temperature is a bit lower as well. Then your extremities aren't as warm, so they tend to look a bit redder and pinker. Luckily, we've got super awesome color editor tools where we can correct that really easily. Now, if you were watching last week about the color editor, you would have seen kind of manual ways to do it, but we've got 4 images here, which, are roughly, or actually almost identical lighting. The only difference really is that she's changing her pose. So to do 4 manually drawn masks would maybe take a bit too long. So once you get to a bit more practice doing this, you could really get quite speedy. Okay, let's get rid of that layer. So is this my filled layer? No. So new filled layer, like so. Alan says, why doesn't luminosity mask auto fill layer as default? We did think about that, but there are some times when, especially if you get a bit sort of speedier at doing it, you could set the Luma range and then paint the mask in. It's kind of less likely to happen, but it could happen. Anyway, so let's hit Luma range. And then let's start to just find the skin tone, which is kind of in the middle. So if I squeeze this down, losing it a bit there, and then squeeze down the highlights, then at some point we're going to lose the reflection on her nose. So we need to go back a bit, and let's just make the fall off a bit greater so it's a bit softer. Now in this view with the red mask, it's kind of a bit hard to see. So let's apply it right now, and let's change to grayscale mask. So it's still M, but it's an Alt key M. So let's say display grayscale mask, and that will give you an easier representation of what the mask is doing. So white is masked areas, black is non-masked areas. So now the good thing is the Luma range is always editable. So you can see it has a little sun. So if I go back into it, I can decide, well, can I go further this way? Not really. Could I go further this way? Might make a bit of sense just to do that. And now, as Terence was asking about feathering, so we've got these 2 sliders here, radius and sensitivity. Now basically at 0, if radius is at 0, that effectively deactivates the sensitivity slider. So even if I drag the sensitivity slider around, nothing's going to happen. So radius at 0, sensitivity does nothing. So we need to bring up the radius to activate it. And really what the sensitivity slider is how the mask wraps around edges. So Terence, if you want a feathery mask, you would have 0 sensitivity. If you want a mask that wraps tightly around your subject, you would want 100. So if I bring up the radius to around whatever, let's just go kind of in the middle, and then take the sensitivity down to 0. So you can see that's effectively feathering it. Now if we take sensitivity all the way up to 100 and wait a few seconds, you can see it finds the edges basically. So with something like this, we probably want to feather it a little bit, I would say. So let's do probably bias it somewhere around there. And then this way it's nice and subtle, if you like. So now we've got a mask on our skin. Let's apply that. M to come out of the mask. Let's do some clever stuff in the color editor. So we're going to go into the skin tone tab. So if I go in the skin tone tab, and if you want to know more about this, then watch our short tutorial or last week's webinar. But basically we grab our color picker, we look at our subject, and we think which skin tone is the best, the desirable skin tone. So I'm going to pick around here somewhere because that looks pretty good. Now that gives us a dot on the color editor. That is where I picked. And we've got 3 sliders down here which relate to uniformity. And what essentially happens is as I drag any of these sliders across, anything that's within this triangle range gets converted to my picked spot. So, for example, if I drag hue all the way across, like so, then anything in this range gets matched to that dot. I could probably pull out this way a bit. So now if I do saturation, then saturation gets matched, and lightness, we have to be a bit careful because then we ruin all the nice lighting that Tina did when she took this picture. Tina Eisen, by the way, who gave me these nice shots. So now if I turn this layer off and back on, you can see the difference in what it's doing to the skin tone, saturation, and so on. So if you feel, well, that's, you've gone a bit too over the top there, we can just moderate these down so we still get some of those nuances, like so. Now, the nice thing is, of course, is that even though we've got 4 different shots, they're identical lighting, identical issue, if you like. So what we can do is, if we turn on our grayscale mask, Option M, so you can see what's happening, let's select them all, like so. 1, 2, 3, 4. Go to my layers tool, click on the up down arrow, and now say apply, and that's going to copy my layer mask with the luminosity adjustment and the color edits. So it's important to get in your head that it's going to copy basically a filled layer and apply the luminosity constraint to it and do those color edits. So it's not going to copy the mask if it was rasterized, which if I rasterized it, it would. It's going to be the full mask plus the luma range constraint plus the layer edits. So let's hit the button, apply. Take a few seconds, got some number crunching to do, and you can see the mask snap across like so. And then now if I go to, let's just pick another shot. Let's get rid of the mask and look at the color editor. You see it's got my color edit. If we look at the layers and we turn the layer on and off, you can see what it's doing to the skin, for example. Now, of course, if you want to, what I could do if you felt, oh, actually this mask, it's a bit too whatever, it's got a bit too much maybe on the lips or whatever, there's nothing to stop you erasing, because we can always erase like so, and I'm doing this crudely, but you could spend a bit more time on it. We can erase because we're just getting rid of that mask like so. If I brush back in, so watch this, if I brush back in, so B for brush, if I brush back in, you see it's only going on my luminosity range. Even if I try and brush over here in the black, nothing's happening because it doesn't fit to my current luminosity range. But this is a really sort of nice expedited way to get skin tone masks and color edits across a whole bunch of images without having to do it manually. So, okay. Is the color editor webinar available? Yes, it will be in exactly the same place as this one when it goes up. So it's everything's on our Learning Hub. I'll show you at the end. What do we got? Could never get my head around how you copy this to other pics. I know the top arrows, but that's not what was used here. No, so this is basically only copy this tool panel, if you like. Could be the same for anything else. So you see every tool has a little copy apply icon. So that's only copy apply this tool panel or the contents of this tool. So if we go to the first one, let's just get rid of the mask. And we did an exposure adjustment on the background. Let's just lighten it a bit. And I select the others and we do copy, exposures ticked and apply. Then it will do the exposure adjustments to the others. Nice thing is about this is that, of course, all the layers are still intact and all our color edit changes are there as well. So works super nice. Okay. Let's see. What are we doing on the next ones? All right, now something really important or common, if you like, is dodging and burning. So selective lightning and selective burning. Sorry, selective lightning and selective darkening. I'm trying to read and talk at the same time, which really doesn't help. Teague was basically saying, those I hadn't had them selected. I did, because you see they're selected here and selected in the window. So watch the recording back and you'll see exactly how it works. So super simple. Okay, so dodge and burn, lighten and darken. And this is where we're going to have a combination of various different edits on one image. And we're going to do it in a nice professional way as opposed to a bit of a bodge. So we've got this shot here. Let's hide the browser so we've got a bit more room. This guy here, the rest of the shot is nicely exposed and edited and so on and so forth. But this guy is just falling into a little bit of shadow. It would be nice if we could lighten him up a bit. Let's go a bit bigger, just sort of starting to get a bit too dark for the rest of the shot. So the, what's the word? The can't think of the right word, but the easy thing to do is think, okay, I want to lighten this up, so I'm going to draw a mask. So I'm going to get my brush, I'm going to draw a mask on this guy, something like that. You might spend a bit more time, and then I'm going to go to a tool and think, well, exposure, I'm going to brighten it up. Wow, that looks rubbish. Capture One's terrible or something. That's really just poor technique. So let's delete that layer and we do it in a proper way that any of you can do. So once again, I'm going to start with a new filled layer. So if we press M, again, that's a mask on the whole image, like so. So now we can think, well, what's the best case for this dude and his daughter? How can we brighten that in the best of our abilities? So exposure might not be the best thing. That's going to brighten everything to the same amount. So if I look at curves and let's go to the Luma curve, if I hover my mouse over the areas that I want to brighten, you can all see it sitting. If you look at the orange line, it's all kind of roughly sitting down in the 3/4. So I want to brighten that up. So if I grab or stick a control point here, I can brighten this and think, okay, what's the best case we can get to for this guy's shirt? Let's just control the highlights, and I might sort of overdo it a bit as well, but that's the brightest that I want him to be. And by using the Luma channel and not the RGB, it means the color won't shift. So the color is going to be exactly the same as it was when it's darker or lighter. So that will kind of work. And also we could consider, well, I don't want it to get too flat, so let's just chuck a bit of contrast in there and maybe some clarity as well. So that's the best case for this guy. So now I'm going to right click and say clear mask. And someone asked earlier, what's the difference between clear and delete? Well, if I delete the mask, which is the minus, then the mask is gone, and also my underlying adjustments, which I did with my curve, clarity, and so on. So clearing the mask just gets rid of the mask, basically. But so if we say clear mask, Boom, the mask is gone, but I've still got my underlying adjustments. Now we can brush it back in, but first of all, the impetus, I think the word I was looking for earlier, is that we just start brushing. So let's do that, and now it just looks really kind of obvious like it did before. So that's no good. So let's clear the mask once more. And what we need to do is use flow. So flow control, really important. So if flow is at 100, let's bring that back up. So if flow is at 100, so one sort of click drag of the mouse, pen, or the same with the mouse, makes no difference, means that my adjustment that I did with the curves will be applied in one stroke. So it's basically all or nothing in one hit. Now, if we reduce the flow, say down to 5%, it means as I brush back and forth, we're going up in 5% increments. So we'll be 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and so on. So I'll get 20 brush strokes before I kind of top out that adjustment. Now, if I change the opacity down to 50, then my adjustment would top out at 50%. So I could probably even drop flow even lower, say down to 3%. And then what we can do is that we just brush back and forth gradually, and then it will slowly build up my adjustment. So if one area needs a bit more, I can give it more. And then if one area needs a bit less, then it can have a bit less. So it's got a lot more control than what we did before, essentially. So you might think, well, David, nothing's happened to this image. It looks exactly the same. But if we turn the layer off, you can see before and after. And no one would ever know this had been manually brightened, if you like. And if I need to give any area a bit more than any others, I can just brush more, basically. If I've gone too far, I could just press E for erase and then just knock it back a bit again. So it's really, really simple. If we do Option M, you can see the mask. So it looks a lot more varied and a lot more subtle than it does if we just whacked that whole adjustment in one go. Flow is back and forth, Alan. You don't have to lift and reset. So before flow control, your only other option was to have a low opacity and do click drag, click drag, click drag, which was kind of annoying. So easy peasy. And I haven't controlled any effect on the edges. Robert, it's just basically a nice soft brush. So you can't really have any inclination or tell that this was brightened. It just works really nicely. So again, if we look at a slightly different example, and you can do exactly the same principle for darken as well. I wrote darken here, but this is also another lighten example. So I think I had too much coffee yesterday or something. But this dude is a little bit different because again, we can combine a few more adjustments. So base corrections are probably pretty good. I might just lift the exposure a tiny bit. Don't want to go too bright. Let's have a little bit of vignetting like so. Let's brighten up the mid-tones slightly with brightness. But his face and his eyes, they're a bit too dark, really. So we do the same thing again before, new filled layer. So that's mask over the whole image. And think, okay, how do we best brighten this? Well, he's sitting in shadow, basically. So let's use shadow recovery a bit and a bit of exposure. And again, I'll probably overcook it. And so it doesn't go too flat. Let's have some contrast in there as well. So now his face looks pretty good, but the rest of the image is too bright. So once again, let's clear the mask, grab a brush, make it a bit bigger, a bit softer. No one will ever know. And my flow is nice and low. So then now we can just basically gradually lighten those areas that we want to have. Maybe just a bit down here as well. And because this was mostly shadow recovery, it's not going to have any effect on turban. That's probably not right, but it's not going to have any effect on his headwear because this is in shadow. So I don't have to be super critical. I can just brush quite happily. It's not going to brighten up his cup. The most it would do would be by 0.2 of a stop. I'm sure we could handle that, but we can always drop that back down. But because most of my adjustment, you'll see here if I change the shadow recovery, was on shadow recovery, it's not affecting any of the highlight areas. Like so. And again, if you think you've overcooked it, you could just bring the opacity back of the individual layer, for example. But I think that's pretty good around there. Once again, if we turn the layer off, you can see before and after, like so. Nice and simple, but no one would ever know there was an additional bit of exposure adjustment going on in there. No need to try and do complex auto masking or anything like that. Just good technique with flow and a nice soft brush. Could I lower the brightened area outside the figure? Yeah, like if we wanted to get rid of the pans and Graham says, "Hi, you didn't name your layers." Yes, correct. Darken. Sorry, Graham. I always forget. So let's do a new filled layer once more. Oh no, sorry, that was lighten. Bloody hell, lighten. There we go. This one is going to be darken. So that's currently a filled layer. So if we want to just darken down, these areas, we could do exposure. We could do a bit of highlight recovery to get rid of that highlight. We could probably even just drop the curve on the shadow a bit. Don't want to block it up or anything. So once again, right click, clear mask, grab a brush, probably go nice and big and soft, and then we can just kill any area that we feel is too bright. So you're essentially making your own sort of complex radial mask, if you like. So radial mask probably would have solved this, but this way we can give extra attention to areas that need it a bit more, like so. So now if we turn this off, you can see before and after, like so. Can you say, where is it? Can you save brush configurations? No, and it would be nice to be able to save like a layer stack, like my dodge burn layer and so on. It's not possible, unfortunately. And it's not because we don't think it's a bad idea. We think it's a great idea, but there's just a few kind of workflow issues to solve, mostly because there's a 16 layer limit. So what if you wanted to add one of your layer presets to something that had 14 layers on it and you were adding 3? So obviously one of them would have to be skipped. So it's mostly kind of UI based complications rather than anything technical in Capture One. I have seen someone solve it with AppleScript. So if you're an AppleScript nerd, you can actually write an AppleScript that will make layers and name them and all this kind of other stuff. So that could be something maybe as a good stopgap. Okay. Peter says, this is great. I suck at selective. And really that's the whole point. You don't need to be selective a lot of the time. It's really not necessary. The more selective you are, sometimes the worse it actually looks. And actually the next example talks about that a little bit. Because if you have a really super accurate mask, it becomes really obvious that you've done something, and it looks kind of that overcooked HDR look and so on and so forth. So yes, not possible to do with presets, but would also be nice. Alrighty. Okay, so next one I think probably answers Leon's question. Yes, refine and feather. So we've got a lovely image from Tina Eisen again. I actually did this by mistake this morning on the Photoshop file. I'd forgotten I had put the Photoshop file in and was doing all the masking stuff on the Photoshop file, and someone said, but that's a Photoshop file. In actual fact, all the stuff that you've seen today, if you wanted to, you could do on your TIFFs and PSDs as well. But let's go with the raw data. So sometimes, let's zoom in. This looks pretty amazing straight out of camera. But let's say you want to do create a mask from the color editor. So let's do that. Now, when you create masks from the color editor, again, like Peter was saying, like very selective masking, or I was saying rather, in relation to Peter, that very selective masking kind of sucks and doesn't look that great. So if we go to our color editor and we use advanced, not skin, and we pick our pale flower here, for example. So I'm going to pick around here. And if we turn on view selected color range, that will tell us what is part of our color range. So just to make sure, I'm going to expand out the range just to make sure I've got everything. Turn that off. And if I grab lightness, you can see that it's doing a pretty good job, but it's actually affecting a little bit of the lips as well. Now I could futz around with a color editor, or I could solve it just by creating a layer. So I'm going to go here and say create mask layer from selection. And what this will do is basically convert this color range into a mask. So now here's our layer 1. So that was from the color editor for Graham's benefit. And if we do Option M, you can see what the mask looks like so. Now I can actually edit this a little bit. So if I press Option M, I can see, okay, it's just caught a bit of this. So if I press E for erase, then I'll just get rid of, get flow up. I'll just get rid of the kind of extraneous bits that we don't want. So we just have the flower. I'm trying to erase something here, but it's dust on my monitor. Always clever. Okay, but now if we went to try and adjust this, let's just grab exposure. So if we just try and adjust this, I'll just zoom in like to ridiculous amounts so you can see. But this edge is like, it's too good, you know, it's not realistic. So if I wanted to darken this flower down, you can just see like this haloing isn't very nice. And around here, it just doesn't really do a great job. So this is where refine and if I go really dark, you can really see it doesn't look good. So this is where refining and feather come in. Now, again, it's easiest to see what's going on with grayscale mask. So we do that. And then if I right click and we say feather, Leon was asking, then that basically, whoa, let's turn that down a bit. That just makes the edges feathered. So you see, the more we go up, the more feathered it is, which works fine in some cases, and it might work okay in this case. Let's try it. So if we just turn the mask off and we right click and we say feather, then it's actually not too bad. But it depends what adjustment you're doing as well. I would generally favor using refine mask a lot of the time. So again, if we look at our grayscale mask, Option M, right click and say refine, this is a more complex set of maths basically. Feather will just make the edges fluffy and soft. But if we say refine, what you'll see is it will just blend better into the surroundings. So it will give us a more believable mask, if you like. So now if I say apply, we now don't have the sort of nasty edge syndrome that we had before. And if I wanted to, of course, I could always add to this mask. If I take my brush, if I just wanted to make sure I included some of those feathers. Oh, brush went a bit weird for a second. So if I just wanted to make sure we had a bit more of this stuff going on, we could just gradually whiz that back in. I just stay away from my edges like so. But refine mask is just really handy if you have, you know, like a complex subject like that, where you want to have nice believable edges, or you've made it from the color editor as well. So let's press M to come back out of that. Let's zoom back out, fit screen. And then now we could play around with that. So we could make it darker. We could have some more contrast. We could throw in a bit more structure and so on. And to try and selectively mask that by hand, It just take too long and too painful. Might as well use the tools that we have just to edit it nicely. Okay. In reference to the 16 layers, I'll answer your question when we get to that. I'll get to cloning and healing and so on. Could we deal with flyaway hair? You could, but if you had lots of flyaway hair, then you're just better off bouncing out into Photoshop and doing a round trip, basically. And there was another question which I missed earlier. Where was it? Missed it, sorry. Okay, not to worry. There was a question which I wanted to answer, but I couldn't find it. All right, so we've only got a few minutes left. So let's quickly look at what Stefan was asking, kind of removing objects. And it works pretty nicely, but it does have a limitation, which I will talk about. So this is the same image where we just did our little bit of lightning down here. So what if we wanted to remove this cable or pipe or whatever? In this case, we would click and hold, and we want to say new heal layer. So you have clone and heal. Clone will just do a like for like copy from one bit of the image, or copy the pixels from one part of an image to another. Heal will do a better job matching luminosity, so it looks actually more believable. So let's say new heal layer, like so, and you see the icon is different. It looks like a little plaster. Grab our brush. Let's make this a little bit larger. And you can try to let Capture One choose the source point if you like. So I could just start brushing up here and let Capture One try and figure out what to replace it with. Or we can hold down our Alt key and say, I want to copy pixels from here. So I'm going to do that. And then we're going to copy them up the cable like so. So now if I press M, I'll just get rid of the mask. You can see it's done its healing quite nicely there. Now the caveat for this, or limitation if you like, and it is a limitation, is that each layer can only have one source point. So if I then wanted to get rid of these paint flecks, for example, I'd then say plus new heal layer, like so. Grab my brush, option click to get my source point kind of here, and then I would brush in to get rid of that, basically, like so. You can also, if you need to move the source point a little bit, so I didn't get that quite right, you can just grab it and you can tweak it. Obviously that's going to be too high, so I just need to bring it down to something like probably, whoops, too much, around there, basically. Oh, too high again. Anyway, you get the idea. You can always move the source points and the painted point around just to fit better. What's the effect of pen pressure? Just changes opacity. Since we had flow introduced, I don't really have any need for it. So, but it will affect the opacity of the brush. But opacity, again, is something I rarely change because of having flow in the brush and the ability to change the opacity in the layer itself as well. So like our lighten here, I shall name that again. If we went too far, we can just change the opacity with the slider, for example, rather than having to mess around with brush opacity. Okay, are there any keyboard shortcuts? Yes, there's keyboard shortcuts for everything. The reason why I don't show them is it's hard for you to follow, but everything you see in that window you can apply a shortcut for, and also for adding various different kinds of layers. So if you go to edit keyboard shortcuts, best thing to do, just type layer in the search box, and then all the various different things come up like so. So adding various different layers, I think if I type brush, then you've got all the different brush dynamics which you can add shortcuts to as well. What I will say is, if you do have the brush selected and you right click, the cursor is always bang on top of the size slider. So you don't even have to look at the screen. So it's always exactly on the size slider wherever you click. So that's just kind of good to know as well. Steve says, were you looking for my question, how to mimic Lightroom dehaze? Well, actually, the only thing that dehaze is really doing is it's not actually anything that fancy. It's pretty much just a good levels adjustment. And quite often it's worth doing another layer in the sky if it's particularly hazy. But if we find an old shot here, so this is hazy, for example. So that's how it comes out the camera. I mean, haze is mostly caused by just sort of the levels. So if we look at the levels, we might find that the blue channel is not sitting quite where it needs to be. So first of all, if you just do A for auto in levels, you can try that. But generally, if you do have some haze, if you go to the preferences and look at channel mode for levels, if you change this to individual channels and hit auto, then it will do a better job. And then basically bit of contrast, bit of clarity, we can pretty much get rid of any sort of haze that we want. So it's really just contrast, clarity is the best way to get rid of haze. If I wanted to get rid of a bit more here, do that linear gradient mask and whack a bit more clarity in. I think with Lightroom, you've got to be a little bit careful of clarity. You can overcook it, but you know, in Capture One, you can actually heap it in and the image still looks quite nice. Okay, back on subject. Last couple of little shortcut things that you can do. So let's say you want to fill in a large area with a mask, but not the whole image. The only thing you need to do is to outline it. Let's bring up flow. So if I just do a quick mask around the edge here. So around, just whiz round our man like so. Now you could brush and fill it in, but that's a bit slow and boring. So if you right click and say fill, that will just fill the mask in. So that would just save you a bit of time if you just need to do, you know, a quick edit like so. So that's the first shortcut. Second one, if you want to draw some straight lines, start off and just click once. So you can see my mask. Hold your shift key down and click once again. And click, and click. And then this way, we can just draw around any shape that we like. And once again, we could say fill mask like so. And that just gives you a nice speedy way to kind of draw around those areas. Alrighty, I think pretty much bang on time. So let's just look at the last question. Still no layers for black and white? Correct. Yep. You can't use the black and white tool in a layer. Not again that we don't think it's a good idea. It's just a technical limitation. Could I extend the backdrop with heal and clone? Yes, you could do, Peter. I would think if you wanted to, that would make sense. I don't know how effective it would be. Again, it's a balance of, is it easier to do it in Capture One or is it easier to do it in Photoshop or Affinity or something like that? Peter says, if I don't own a tablet and just use a mouse, should I ignore the brush settings for pen pressure and airbrush? Pen pressure won't make any difference, correct. Airbrush basically is a time-based adjustment, which, hang on, if we turn flow down, I personally don't have much of a use for it, and I've failed to really think of a use for it. But if you click and hold, it's like a spray can. So it sort of sprays the mask onto the image. And the higher the flow, the sort of faster it will spray, if you like. But to be honest, with flow control, it's just kind of almost negates the need for it as well. Let's see, last couple of questions. Does the color mask work well for mixed lighting conditions? It can do, like in interiors or whatever, or even the skin tone tool, like if you've got a wall which has got some overspill on it from a different kind of light temperature, you can use the uniformity sliders in the skin tone tab to make something the same color. So you could consider that. But it depends how subtle it is. If it's like super subtle pastel color, you might not have any luck. But if you can pick it and then maybe refine the mask or feather it, you might find it will work quite nicely. Can you add a preset to a layer as well? Yes, you can. So all you need to do is go to the layers. So let's see, like if we wanted to apply this style, we could right click and say apply to new layer. And then you can do exactly what you suggested, is to dial the opacity down till you think it looks good. So yes, you can. Let's see. These webinars are great. Thank you. That's great. Alrighty. So I think that wraps up most of the questions. Sorry. What I will say is that, you know, you don't have to learn all the sort of clever tips and tricks. Even just a little bit of dodging and burning can help your images immensely. And in terms of the sort of object removal, I didn't show you, but the images I got the object removal stuff from, I mean, John, a photographer called John Wildgoose in the UK, let's just make this, he really makes full use of all the various different layers and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's possible to do all kinds of cool stuff. Alrighty, so next week we have a very talented guest, Zoe Noble. So she's a photographer, art director, retoucher, originally from the UK, now lives in Germany. She's very skilled at Capture One, and she's going to show us some of her techniques that she uses on her images. So I promise tomorrow I won't forget to send on the follow-up email. So you'll get that sometime tomorrow. As per usual, if I just escape out of this and bring in the Learning Hub, which I've lost. Hang on. Let's Learning Hub. So if you go to learn.phaseone.com/capture1, all the webinars go up here, basically. Now, if you tick on webinar in the filter, then you'll see all the webinars. So there's last week's organizing. There's 5 images. There's the color editor masterclass, and so on. So if you filter by webinar, you'll see them all like so. If you scroll down a bit, you'll always see the next upcoming webinars as well. So that auto populates on the Learning Hub. So that's the best place to see it. And equally, in Capture One itself, if you go to Resource Hub, like so, you'll always see the next webinar in the bottom right hand corner. So there's plenty of different ways to see all the various webinars. Anyway, thanks for joining me today. I hope it was useful, and I hope to see you all again next week with me and Zoe. So take care. Goodbye.